If you would ask a pilot which the safest seat on board an aircraft is, he or she would probably point to the one in the flight deck and say, well, that one, as long as I'm sitting in it. But what about passenger seats? This is a question that keeps popping up. So is there really scientifically a safest seat or a safest part in the aircraft to sit in? Stay tuned. Now, before I start this video, I have a question for you. If you suppose that I, over on the Mentour Pilot channel, would cover every single commercial flight that is taking place, and let's say I covered 3 flights per month, as I usually do, how long do you think that it would take me to cover completely uneventful flights before I got to the first fatal accident? Well, think about that for a moment. We'll come back to that in the end because it will tie in perfectly with what I'm about to cover today. And fair warning to you all, I will be talking about accidents in this episode, but bear with me because I do have a point with it. Back in 1971, a 17-year-old called Juliane Kopke was found by locals wandering around in the Amazon rainforest. Now, it soon turned out that she was the sole survivor of the crash of Lanza Flight 508, and experts think that her survival had a lot to do with where she was sitting in the aircraft. The aircraft involved was a Lockheed L-188 Electra, which had somehow ended up inside of a thunderstorm, something that we today have advanced weather radars to avoid. But in this case, the aircraft had therefore been subjected to severe turbulence, as well as at least one lightning strike. Now, given the technological limitations of that era, the investigators could never fully explain how this all happened. But what we do know for sure is that the aircraft suffered a structural failure and completely broke up while it was still flying in cruise. So how could someone actually survive that? Well, Kopke was sitting at a window seat in a row of 3, and when the aircraft split apart, that row stayed intact and remained attached to a section of the fuselage. And experts think that this piece acted as like a kind of parachute, or maybe started spinning like the blades of a helicopter as it fell, but whatever happened, it somehow slowed the fall down, enough to save Kopke's life. Incredibly, it also later turned out that several more passengers had also survived the mid-air breakup, but unlike Kopke, they had then been so badly injured when they impacted the ground that they had died before they could be rescued. So, does this mean that a window seat could be a little bit more safe? Well, in order to answer that, we will have to look at something more recent, like the Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9, whose door plug blew out in January of 2024. Now, that was a truly terrifying event for everyone on board, but thankfully nobody was sitting next to that opening when the blowout happened. So the only casualties were a couple of phones and a t-shirt of a young passenger sitting in the window seat in front of the door plug. And well, of course, Boeing's reputation, I guess. But back in 2018, a passenger in the window seat of another 737 wasn't quite so lucky. Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 had departed from New York LaGuardia and was cruising at 32,000 feet when its left engine suddenly failed. Now, that failure caused parts of the engine inlet and cowling to break away, hitting the wing and the fuselage as well as a window at row 14. And tragically, a female passenger was sitting next to that window when the piece hit, and she ended up getting partially pulled out through the window, which caused injuries so serious that she ultimately didn't make it. And as it turns out, that wasn't the only case where window seats have proven a little bit risky. Back in 2014, another passenger was hospitalized after a Bombardier Q400 suffered a burst tire during takeoff. The flight then, after that, ended up diverting to Edmonton, but on landing the right main gear collapsed, causing a couple of propeller blades from the right engine to hit the ground and break off. Parts of those blades then penetrated the cabin, injuring a passenger that was sitting at row 7. Now, I know that this all might sound quite scary, but remember, I am scouring the whole world throughout history to give you these specific examples. And you've got to look at the entire context of these accidents before you can draw any sure conclusions from them. Now, not surprisingly, quite a few people have tried to look at historical accidents to see if they can find which aircraft seats are actually the safest. Popular Mechanics, for example, did this with a study they published back in 2007, and using data from the National Transportation Safety Board, they looked at 20 crashes since 1971 who included both fatalities and survivors. And in that study, they found that those sitting at the back had a 69% chance of survival in a crash, while those in the front only had a 49% chance. And passengers sitting next to the wing found themselves somewhere in between those two at about 59%. So this meant that in 11 out of those 20 accidents, survival rates were found to be much better at the back of the aircraft, and only 5 accidents favored first or business class seats. Now, the researchers behind that study connected these findings with the fact that aircraft often crash in a nose-down attitude, at least in the sample that they had, which meant that passengers sitting in the back were better protected. Now, a more recent study by Time magazine instead looked at crashes from 1985 to 2000, and they actually came to a similar conclusion. People in the rear seemed to be safer, and they also found some more interesting facts about the middle seats in each row. In their study, it turned out that these seats only had a 28% fatality rate compared to 44% for aisle seats. And on top of that, they also found that people closer to the exits were more likely to survive, which kind of makes sense since they could get themselves out quicker during an evacuation. So, based on this, should everyone just skip first class and go for middle seats in the rear instead? Well, this study had some big limitations because it only looked at 17 crashes who happened to have published seating charts. And that obviously meant that they couldn't take into account the full context of those accidents. And this also shows the inherent problem with these kind of studies. The sample set is just way too small. There are so many factors that affect survival rates in an accident, like the aircraft's attitude, speed, type of accident, and in what part of the flight that the accident occurred. For example, if we take a look at Turkish Airlines flight 1951, which crashed in Amsterdam Schiphol Airport back in 2009, while it supports the theory that the front seats are worse, the fewest fatalities and critical injuries were actually found among the passengers who were sitting over the wings in this case, with those situated in rows 14 to 17 only suffering some minor injuries. And in contrast, there were several severe injuries in the back, including one fatality, a cabin crew member who was sitting in the tail section. The aircraft involved in that accident was a Boeing 737NG, and one theory was that because it crashed with the gear selected down and with a nose-up attitude, the aircraft ended up breaking up in a way that minimized injuries to those sitting over the wings. Then we have the case of United Airlines Flight 232, who crashed in Sioux City back in 1989 after an engine failure had taken out the hydraulic systems, leaving the crew with only very limited flight controls. Again, the pattern of injuries in that case was completely different. Despite their almost impossible situation, the heroic crew actually managed to lower the landing gear and get the aircraft heading roughly towards a runway, controlling their course and descent rate using only differential thrust from the remaining engines. But even though they had managed to do that, they simply couldn't fully control it during touchdown, so the right wing ended up hitting the surface first, and the aircraft then cartwheeled over and broke apart. But miraculously, there were 184 survivors, and in that case, most of them were actually seated further forward, between rows 9 and 20. Now, this happened to a DC-10 with 5 rows of first class and 38 rows in total, and of the 26 people in first class, 18 were killed and 8 suffered serious injuries. Interestingly though, one passenger who was seated in row 25 by the window and over the wing received no injuries whatsoever. But crucially here, while a lot of passengers seated in rows 23 to 38 were killed, half of them actually succumbed to smoke inhalation. So it wasn't the crash that got them, instead it was the smoke before they had a chance to evacuate. Now, while the studies that I've mentioned before show that there might be seats that are better than the rest, it turns out that scientists haven't just looked at statistics in order to try and answer this question. They've actually also crashed a real aircraft, and I'll tell you all about that after this. When we're on the topic of passenger safety, this actually reminds me of the FAA's recent safety review of Boeing. And if you're not familiar with the details, don't worry, I've got you covered. Meet Ground News, today's sponsor, and if you want to follow along, use this QR code. Ground News is my go-to app and website for getting the full story of whatever I'm researching from every perspective, and they've been a long-time supporter of my work, so I am super happy to share them with you. When I started looking into that FEA investigation using Ground News, I found coverage from over 50 different sources worldwide, and comparing those perspectives really helped me to see the bigger picture. For example, left-leaning US-based Associated Press focused mostly on accountability and passenger safety, calling out systemic issues at Boeing. And on the other hand, the right-leaning First Post framed the story around Boeing's economic and operational challenges under regulatory scrutiny. Many of you have shared your frustration with the sensationalism in mainstream media today, and this is where Ground News offers a real solution, helping you to see beyond the headlines and access well-rounded context. Now, I can't recommend Ground News enough, and if you want to try them, scan this QR code or go to ground.news/mentor now. This will give you a fantastic 50% off unlimited use of the same Vantage plan that I use. And remember that they are subscriber funded, so by signing up, you're not only supporting my work directly, you're also helping to bring transparency to the information that we all consume. Thank you, Ground News. Now back to the story. Back in 2012, a pretty amazing experiment was set up. A Boeing 727-200 was loaded up with cameras, scientific instruments and crash test dummies, and then sent off to crash into the ground in Mexico. Now, this was partially a scientific study, but it was also made for television, so while we could learn some stuff from it, there are also some questions about how scientific this really was. And also, due to copyright rules, we are sadly not able to show you the actual footage, but here is how they did it. The aircraft took off with real pilots initially operating it, and they then set it up so it could be controlled remotely before parachuting out to safety, for which the 727's rear air stairs came in quite handy, by the way. Now, after the pilots had left, another pilot then remote controlled the aircraft into the ground at a predetermined location. So, what did the crash actually end up looking like then? Well, the aircraft touched down at a speed of around 120 knots, which is a fairly average approach speed. But when it touched down, it did so with a descent rate of 1,500 feet per minute, which is much higher than what you would see on a stable approach, where the descent rate is not supposed to be more than 1,000 feet per minute. And also, crucially, during a normal landing, this descent rate is then arrested by a flare in the end, where the rate would have been significantly decreased to around maybe 200 to 300 feet per minute, but not in this case. This meant that the 727 ended up hitting the ground with a nose-down attitude, breaking it up into several different pieces. Large sections actually survived the crash, including most of the fuselage, and even the nose section with the cockpit stayed mostly in one piece, despite breaking off from the rest of the aircraft. As for the crash test dummies on board, well, the ones in the front didn't do very well. The ones over the wings were mostly okay, but showed some injuries, mainly to their lower limbs, as well as some impact from flying debris. But curiously, most of the dummies in the back could have actually been walking away from the crash, if they would have been able to walk, that is. Now, regarding those leg injuries to the dummies in the middle section, they were mainly to the ankles and had likely happened because of the brace position that all of the dummies had been placed in during the crash. Bracing is the recommended position to adapt, since it helps prevent serious spinal and head injuries, and if you have looked closely at the safety cards during the safety briefing, they will tell you to put your feet flat on the floor and further back than your knees to avoid hitting the seats in front. And after that, you should bend at the waist and put your head down. Now, this helps protect your head and spine from secondary impacts and flying debris, and it also stops your limbs from flailing around. But it also puts extra weight on your lower legs, which keeps them from moving forward if the plane would suddenly stop. But this extra weight also puts some extra stress on your ankles, hence those injuries. Now, even though those kind of injuries can definitely affect you, your ability to quickly evacuate after an impact, which is not ideal, the brace position is still the recommended position to adapt, since it gives you the overall best protection. The modern brace position was actually developed after studying injuries inflicted on passengers in the Kegworth air disaster, which I have also featured over on the Mentour Pilot channel. When that accident happened, the captain announced, "Brace for crash landing," just 10 seconds before impact, and investigators could therefore study the injuries of the passengers who braced compared to those who didn't. This became pretty much the first real research into what position worked best, and we're still using those results today. By the way, in that accident, people in the back also survived best. But remember, this aircraft hit the ground nose first into an embankment at a fairly controlled descent rate. So what would happen if the aircraft attitude would be different in an accident then? But for that we can take a look at Asiana Flight 214, a Boeing 777 that was attempting to land in San Francisco when the accident happened. Now, as I explained in my video on that flight, the aircraft ended up far too low and slow, well below the glide path, which resulted in them basically flying into the sea wall at the runway threshold with a higher nose attitude. And because of that, the aircraft ended up hitting the ground tail first. Now, not surprisingly, there was therefore a much higher number of injuries among the people that were sitting in the rear cabin, since that section took up the brunt of the impact forces, even though the aircraft ended up cartwheeling after that first impact. So it looks like aircraft attitude and the passenger's ability to quickly evacuate are the two most important survival aspects in an accident. But obviously, there is no real way to know those factors when you're choosing your seats. So to recap, the problem isn't that the statistics showing fewer injuries in the rear are wrong, it's that there are so many different types of survivable accidents where other parts of the airplane could actually be better options. And there are also so few accidents in total that the statistics are of limited value. But what about seat design then? Could being cocooned in a first-class suite maybe keep you safer? Well, no. All aircraft seats, including the fully reclining first-class seats and basic no-frills economy seats, have to meet pretty much the same safety requirements. This includes being able to withstand a force of 16 G in an aircraft that would very suddenly stop, and seat manufacturers actually test this by strapping in unfortunate crash test dummies in these type of seats and then shooting them down a track at super high speed. They then also test for pitch, roll and yaw moments, as well as something called head injury criterion, which is basically whether the seat can help protect against head injuries. Then there are things like how fire resistant the materials are and how retrievable the life vest is. It is a very long list that these seats need to comply with. But the point here is that all passenger seats are tested dynamically in many ways, and when it comes to safety, there's no difference between a low-cost economy seat and a luxury first-class seat. Now, if we're talking comfort, well, then it's a different story. Now, as for seating position, all of the seats are tested upright and with the seat belt securely fastened. The upright position is important in order for both you having the right posture, but also to allow the people behind you to evacuate more easily. And yes, even those fully reclined first-class seats must be upright for takeoff and landing. So please, when the cabin crew tells you to put your seat up and your belt on, always do it. It could really save your life. Now, I know that there are going to be questions about why we don't mount the seats facing backwards instead, and whilst that would maybe be marginally safer, it would also impact the traveler's comfort a lot. On top of that, the seats would have to be made heavier, because the brace position would then be changed to a more upright stance, which would then create greater forces higher up on the seat structure, requiring them to be built differently. Obviously, that is not desirable from an economic standpoint, and it would only lead to a marginal safety improvement overall, so the comfort and economy took precedence here. And that's actually also the reason for not giving 4-point seat belts for all passengers. Now, I know that that might sound stupid, but given the minuscule amount of accidents happening, today's seats are a good compromise between the safety needed in a potential emergency and the comfort and flexibility requested by the traveling public. It really is as easy as that. But then there is, of course, the matter of the evacuation, which can drastically affect survivability in case an emergency would arise. Things like smoke, fire, or injuries that occur during evacuations combined with where you are sitting could then play a big part in your safety. But it would likely have more to do with how you act and prepare than the seat position in itself. During the accident of Japan Airlines Flight 516, which happened in the beginning of 2024, I was super impressed and pleased to see that the passengers left their hand luggage behind and followed the cabin crew's instructions. This was likely a big reason for the success of that evacuation. So I just want to really clarify and emphasize that if you find yourself in the unlikely situation of having to evacuate an aircraft, do not bring your hand luggage with you. If you do, that plus the potential panic and confusion that would naturally occur could easily lead to blocked exits and a slower than needed evacuation, which in turn could cause people to succumb to smoke inhalation or a potential fire behind you. Not to mention the fact that the baggage with sharp edges and corners, for example, could potentially damage the emergency slides and therefore disable them for other passengers. Now, in the Japan Airlines accident, all of the passengers managed to evacuate in the end, but the evacuation still ended up taking far too long time. It actually took a full 8 minutes before the first emergency exit was activated, and the crew was then able to only use 3 out of the 8 emergency exits available. These were the 2 forward exits, L1 and R1, plus the aft left exit, L4. The aircraft also ended up positioned with the nose down angle, so the passengers were not able to jump and slide down the front slides, which further slowed down the evacuation. But despite all of that, everyone managed to get out safely, and again, this was likely because of the clear instructions from the cabin crew, as well as the way that the passengers responded to those instructions. So again, to recap, having an aisle seat and being closer to an emergency exit might help you to get out quicker. And one thing that I always advise people to do is to check where their nearest exit is located before they even sit down. Because we humans, we are basically animals, and as such, we have a tendency to want to follow the same way we came in if we need to get out. But that's rarely the best thing to do. So the next time that you sit down, just have a quick look around you and make a mental plan for which exit you will use in case it would be needed. Also, try to count the number of seat backs you have to pass in order to reach that exit, so that even if you can't see due to darkness or smoke, for example, you will still be able to find it. Now, the cabin crew's pre-flight briefing actually always mentions this, but most people doesn't really listen to that, sadly. So, this video has only been one big build-up to answer the question in the very beginning. Is it actually worth thinking about which seat is the safest? Well, no, not really. Today, and for the past 30 years or so, we've been flying generation 3 and 4 aircraft, and this, combined with advancing procedures, technical aids, rules and regulations, has meant that flying today has become incredibly safe and is still improving. So in reality, which seat you choose will have very little impact on how safe you are. Every one of the seats on board established airlines are likely going to be much safer than the seat in your car or bus that brought you to the airport. Just to give you a small idea here, let's have a look at some data from the International Air Transport Association, IATA. Out of 37.7 million flights in 2023, there was just one recorded fatal accident. Just one. And this means that statistically, the average person would have to take a flight every day for 103,239 years before experiencing a fatal accident. And that finally brings us to the question that I asked right at the start of this video. Remember how long time it would take for me to reach a fatal accident on Mentour Pilot if I covered all flights? Well, according to my calculations, it would take somewhere around 200,000 years before I got to the first flight that had a fatal accident in it. And that would probably make for a pretty boring YouTube channel. You see, when I cover incidents and accidents over on the Mentour Pilot channel, it might feel like they're happening all the time, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Instead, those videos actually form part of what makes aviation as safe as it is, because the aviation industry always share our findings publicly. And by doing that, we learn from every mistake that is being made. That's why every flight that you're on is a little bit safer than the previous one. And when you hear stories about incidents or near misses, that's actually part of the safety work and a sign of a healthy safety culture. It's when you hear nothing that you should really start to worry. So as a final summary, choose a reputable airline with good standards, choose a seat which offers you the comfort level that you want, but always listen to the cabin crew's safety briefing. And finally, act professionally. Even in your role as a passenger, it is potentially important and super appreciated by your crew. Now, that's my best advice for you, and that's also how I always fly myself as a passenger. But do you have any questions on this topic, or do you want me to cover something else? Let me know in the comments here below and give me a like when you're down there. Now, if you want to support the work that my team and I do and also participate in live hangouts, previews of videos and much more, then consider joining my Patreon crew. You can also now gift a membership to someone you think will appreciate it. Just go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and check it out. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are. Watch these videos next, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.